The aircraft hummed softly as it prepared for takeoff. Passengers settled into their seats, some eager for the journey ahead, others exhausted from long travels. But amid the quiet luxury of first class, something was off. A flight attendant, her arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line, loomed over a teenage girl. Her voice was cold, edged with irritation. "You shouldn't be here. Move to economy. Now." The girl blinked, startled, but held up her boarding pass. A first-class ticket, window seat, fully paid. The flight attendant barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "I don't know how you got this, but this seat isn't for you." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. Sophia's heart pounded. She felt the heat of a dozen silent stares as she gripped her bag, forcing herself to keep her head high. Fighting back tears, she turned and walked toward the back of the plane. What the flight attendant didn't know was that Sophia's father owned the entire airline, and at 35,000 feet, justice would soon be served. Before we continue the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Sofia Navarro tucked her boarding pass into her hoodie pocket, her fingers tightening around it. This was her first time flying alone, and she had been both nervous and excited for the experience. Her father had surprised her with a first-class ticket, a reward for her hard work. It felt like a dream. Spacious seating, plush cushions, and a level of comfort she had never known in economy. She adjusted her hoodie, put in her earbuds, and leaned back, eager to enjoy the flight. She wasn't looking for attention. She was just another passenger. More travelers boarded, filling the aisles with quiet chatter. The flight crew moved through the cabin, checking seat belts and assisting passengers. That's when Megan Brooks, a senior flight attendant, made her way down the row. Her polished uniform was crisp, her demeanor professional, as she greeted passengers with a practiced smile. Then her eyes landed on Sophia. Her expression changed instantly. The warmth in her features faded, replaced with something colder, something distant. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before tilting her head, scanning Sophia's casual outfit, then glancing at her seat number. She inhaled sharply, straightening her posture. "Miss, I believe you're in the wrong section." Megan's tone was polite, but firm. Sophia looked up, confusion flickering across her face. "No, I think this is my seat." Her voice was quiet but steady. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her ticket, holding it up. Megan took it, her fingers tightening around the edges as her eyes scanned the details. A flicker of hesitation passed over her face, just enough to make Sophia uneasy. Then, Megan let out a sharp breath and shook her head. "There's been a mistake. This is a first-class ticket." Sophia frowned. "I know." Megan's tone sharpened. "First class is reserved for premium passengers. This seat is not available." Across the aisle, Jonathan Hayes, a businessman in his 60s, arched an eyebrow but remained silent. Sophia's stomach twisted. Why was she the only one being questioned? She had flown before. Never once had she been spoken to like this. "I promise this is my seat," she repeated, keeping her voice controlled. Megan returned the ticket, but her expression didn't soften. "Where are your parents?" Sophia stiffened. The question hit like a slap. "I'm traveling alone." Megan gave a tight smile, one that held no kindness. "Who gave you this ticket?" Sophia's face burned. Why did that even matter? She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, Megan let out a sigh, the kind an adult gives to a stubborn child. "Look, I don't know how you got this seat, but first class is not for you. You need to move." Sophia's throat tightened. "I don't understand. Why do I need to move?" Megan's answer was simple. "You don't belong in this section." The words cut deeper than Sophia expected. Around her, passengers quickly looked away. No one defended her. No one questioned the flight attendant. They just sat there, pretending not to notice. Sophia felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenched in her lap. She had followed every rule. She had a valid ticket. She wasn't causing trouble. Yet here she was. Megan placed her hands on her hips. Her patience was wearing thin. "If you don't move now, I will have to call security. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." A lump formed in Sophia's throat. She could argue. She could fight. But would they even listen? Slowly she gathered her things, her fingers trembling as she unzipped her bag. The humiliation settled deep in her chest as she stood, her shoulders squared in quiet defiance. As she walked down the aisle, heading toward economy, no one met her gaze. Some passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but silent. Others simply looked past her as if she didn't exist. Near the back of the plane, another flight attendant, Claire Dawson, noticed Sophia as she slipped into an empty seat. Claire had seen the exchange from a distance. Something about it didn't sit right with her. She hesitated for a moment, then took a step forward. "Miss, is everything okay?" Sophia forced a small nod. "They told me I had to move." Her voice was barely a whisper. Claire frowned, glancing toward the front of the plane. She had worked alongside Megan for years, and she knew how she handled certain passengers. This didn't feel like a mistake. This felt wrong. And soon, someone very powerful was going to make sure Megan regretted every second of it. Sophia sank into the narrow seat at the back of the plane, gripping the straps of her backpack. The seat felt stiff, uncomfortable. Nothing like the plush first-class chair she had been forced to leave behind. She kept her gaze locked on the headrest in front of her, willing herself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of people who had refused to speak up. Her pocket vibrated. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers still shaky. A message from her father, Gabriel Navarro, appeared on the screen. "Gabriel, everything okay? Boarded yet?" Sophia hesitated. She could say yes, pretend nothing happened, avoid making a scene. Instead, she typed back, "They made me move, said I couldn't sit in first class." Seconds later, another buzz. "Who made you move?" Sophia swallowed hard. "Sophia, the flight attendant." There was no immediate reply, just silence. She stared at the screen, heart pounding, waiting. Then one last message appeared. "Gabriel Navarro. What's the flight number?" She sent it. This wasn't over. Sophia exhaled, locking her phone and slipping it back into her pocket. The humiliation was still fresh, but she squared her shoulders. She refused to let Megan see her looking defeated. A few rows ahead, Megan Brooks stood by the galley, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Claire Dawson approached, arms crossed. "What was that about?" she asked, nodding toward the economy section where Sophia now sat. Megan didn't bother looking up. "Just fixing a seating mistake." Claire frowned. "Didn't look like a mistake." Megan sighed, stirring her coffee lazily. She didn't belong there. Probably got the ticket through some system error or someone gave it to her. You know how these things happen. Claire's frown deepened. "Did you check the flight manifest?" Megan rolled her eyes. "I didn't need to." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the intercom crackled. "Miss Brooks, please report to the cockpit immediately." Megan's hand froze over her coffee cup. The captain never called a flight attendant to the cockpit unless something serious was happening. Her stomach twisted. She set the cup down, straightened her uniform, and headed toward the front of the plane. Inside the cockpit, Captain Mark Ellis turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't alone. On the screen of the in-flight phone, a sharp-featured man sat in a crisp suit, his posture tense. It took Megan only a second to realize who he was. Gabriel Navarro, the owner of Sky Vista Airlines. Megan's throat went dry. Captain Ellis cleared his throat. "Miss Brooks, we've received a direct complaint regarding your handling of a first-class passenger." Megan forced herself to swallow. "Captain, Gabriel Navarro's voice cut through the silence. "You removed my daughter from her assigned seat." Megan felt her pulse spike. Gabriel's voice was calm, but there was something in it, something heavy. "You told her she didn't belong." His gaze remained cold. "Would you like to explain why?" For the first time in her career, Megan had no answer. The weight of the moment crashed over her. She hadn't just made a mistake, she had humiliated the daughter of the most powerful man in the airline industry. And now, she was about to face the consequences. Megan Brooks' pulse pounded in her ears. Quickly, "Yes, sir," she answered, her voice tight. "I was making sure all passengers were in their assigned seats. I didn't mean to offend anyone." Silence. Then, Gabriel Navarro spoke again, his voice lower, calmer, but somehow heavier. "Did you ask anyone else in first class to prove they belonged there?" Megan's breath caught. She hesitated, lips parting as if to respond, but no words came out. She didn't need to answer. They all knew. Gabriel's voice remained steady. "No." Megan swallowed hard. It wasn't about that. I assumed there was a mistake." "That's the problem," Gabriel interrupted, his tone turning sharp. You assumed. The cockpit felt smaller, the air heavier. Megan had spent years as a senior flight attendant. She prided herself on following procedures, maintaining control, managing difficult situations. But this time, for the first time, she realized she hadn't acted based on policy. She had acted on assumption. Gabriel's words cut through the silence. You embarrassed my daughter in front of an entire cabin. You ignored her valid ticket. You treated her differently. Megan clenched her jaw. She wanted to argue, to defend herself. But she couldn't. The truth was too clear. Gabriel's tone remained controlled, but the authority in his voice was unmistakable. Here's what's going to happen. Megan's stomach twisted. You will personally walk back to my daughter, apologize in front of the passengers, and escort her back to her first-class seat. Megan's hands turned cold. The thought of standing there, admitting her mistake in front of everyone, made her insides churn. Gabriel wasn't finished. If you fail to do this, you will not only be removed from this flight upon landing, but you will also face a full disciplinary hearing. Megan inhaled sharply. That wasn't a warning. That was a promise. For the first time, Captain Mark Ellis, who had been silent until now, spoke. Do you understand, Miss Brooks? Megan's throat was dry, but she forced herself to nod. Yes, I understand. Gabriel didn't say another word. The call ended with a soft click. Megan turned toward the cockpit door, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She had no choice now. She had to go back. And she had to face Sophia. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel the stares from the other flight attendants. They had heard. They knew. Her polished heels clicked against the floor, but for the first time they didn't make her feel in control. They felt like a countdown to her humiliation. At first, the first-class passengers didn't notice her. They were absorbed in their conversations, meals, or screens. But as she moved further down, heading toward economy, the whispers started. Sophia sat stiffly in her cramped seat, arms crossed, staring blankly at the back of the seat in front of her. She wasn't scrolling through her phone. She wasn't reading. She was replaying everything in her mind. She heard the footsteps before she saw her. Megan stopped beside her row, clearing her throat. Nearby passengers shifted, sensing something was about to happen. Slowly, Sophia turned her head. Her face was unreadable. Megan forced a tight, practiced smile. Miss Navarro? She said, her voice quieter than usual. There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class. Sophia didn't move. She simply stared at Megan. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp. Megan's skin prickled under the weight of the silence. She could feel the passengers listening in, waiting to see how this would unfold. I apologize for any inconvenience, Megan added quickly, her voice strained. Sophia blinked, then tilted her head slightly. You're saying it was a misunderstanding? Megan nodded stiffly. Yes, there was. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. An error in seating. An error. That was the best excuse she could come up with. Sophia studied her. For a long moment she said nothing. Then her voice, soft but firm, cut through the silence. I had my ticket, you saw it, and you still told me to move. A few passengers exchanged looks. They had heard everything earlier. They knew Sophia was right. Megan's throat felt tight. She had expected a quick apology to be enough. Say the words, get the girl back to her seat, move on. But this girl, Sophia Navarro, wasn't going to let her off that easy. Megan forced the words out. I may have made a mistake in judgment. Sophia still didn't move. Instead, she reached for her phone. Megan's stomach twisted with unease. Then, Sophia finally looked up at her again. I'll go back. She stood, voice steady. But I want to know why you thought I didn't belong there. Megan froze. She had no answer. Megan Brooks' breath felt shallow. I didn't think, she started, but Sophia cut her off. But you did. Sophia's voice wasn't raised, but the weight of her words made Megan's palms sweat. You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket. Just me. Megan opened her mouth, then shut it again. The silence around them was deafening. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen before were now watching closely. Sophia adjusted her backpack over her shoulder and stepped into the aisle. If you're going to apologize, she said, her voice steady, unshaken, at least tell the truth. Megan's face burned. She had spent years controlling situations like this, setting the rules, deciding how things should run. Now, she wasn't in control at all. And the worst part? A teenager had just stripped away her authority with nothing but the truth. Megan inhaled shakily. I misjudged you. Sophia let the words sit there. She didn't nod. She didn't react. She just let Megan feel them. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the front of the plane. The walk back to first class wasn't a victory march. It wasn't smug. It wasn't arrogant. It was quiet, dignified, and somehow that made it even more powerful. Passengers turned as Sophia entered first class again. Some looked surprised. Others quickly looked away, embarrassed that they had witnessed her humiliation and done nothing. Megan followed behind, feeling smaller with every step. Sophia reached her seat, sat down, and calmly placed her bag beside her. She didn't thank Megan. She didn't need to. Megan stood there, shifting awkwardly. She didn't know what to say. Finally, she muttered, "If there's anything you need." Sophia flipped open her book. She didn't even look at her. Megan turned stiffly and hurried back toward the galley, her face burning with humiliation. She had never felt so exposed before, so completely stripped of power. She had spent years making snap judgments about passengers, deciding who deserved first-class treatment and who didn't. And it had never backfired like this. This time, though, she hadn't just offended any passenger. She had humiliated the daughter of the most powerful man in the airline business. And now, all she could do was wait. Wait for what came next. Megan walked briskly back to the galley, heart pounding. She had done what was asked of her, apologized, escorted Sophia back, but she knew this wasn't over. The humiliation of being forced to admit her mistake in front of an entire cabin clung to her like a heavy coat. She tried to steady her breath, but her hands still trembled slightly. Across the galley, Claire Dawson leaned against the beverage cart, arms crossed. She had seen everything. The forced apology, the power shift, the way Megan had been stripped of her usual authority. That didn't go well, did it? Claire asked, raising an eyebrow. Megan shot her a glare. I don't need your commentary right now. Claire smirked. Just saying, you might want to sit down before you collapse. You look a little pale. Megan ignored her, snatching a cup and filling it with water. She sipped it quickly, trying to calm herself, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. She had no idea what was waiting for her when they landed. But she knew one thing for sure. Gabriel Navarro wasn't the type to let things slide. Meanwhile, Sophia sat comfortably in her first-class seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine. Though she wasn't really reading, she could feel the energy in the cabin shifting. The same people who had ignored her before were now stealing glances at her. Some looked uncomfortable. Some seemed embarrassed. A few even looked guilty. A man a few seats away, Jonathan Hayes, cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward her. I saw what happened earlier, he said hesitantly. Sophia glanced up, her expression unreadable. Did you? He nodded awkwardly. Yes. That was unfortunate. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Unfortunate? Jonathan cleared his throat again, obviously uncomfortable. Yes, well, it was clearly a mistake on the flight attendant's part. Sophia studied him for a moment. Then she gave a small, unimpressed smile. A mistake? Or a choice? Jonathan shifted in his seat, gripping the stem of his wine glass a little tighter. He didn't answer. Sophia didn't push it. She simply returned to her magazine, letting the silence stretch. Her phone vibrated in her lap. She picked it up and read the message. Gabriel Navarro, we land in 45 minutes. Sit tight. A small smile curled at the corner of her lips. Oh, I will, she thought. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone buzzed again. Megan flinched at the sound. She already knew who it was. She lifted the receiver to her ear. This is Miss Brooks. A deep, calm voice spoke on the other end. This is Gabriel Navarro. Megan gripped the phone tighter. His voice wasn't raised. It wasn't angry, but there was something in his tone that made the air feel heavier. You will personally file a full incident report as soon as this flight lands, he said smoothly. I expect a detailed explanation of why my daughter was removed from her seat despite having a valid ticket. Megan's stomach dropped. Megan Brooks swallowed hard. Gabriel Navarro's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. You will also make sure that for the rest of this flight, she receives the exact same service as every other first-class passenger. Nothing less. Megan's fingers tightened around the phone. Yes, sir. The call ended with a soft click. She slowly set the phone back onto the hook, pressing her palms against the counter. They were clammy, cold. She'd made a serious mistake, one she couldn't take back. And now she wasn't just dealing with a difficult passenger. She was dealing with the man who owned the sky she was flying in. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, but inside the cabin, the tension thickened with every passing minute. Megan stood frozen in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter as reality crashed down on her. For years, she'd been the one enforcing rules, making passengers comply, ensuring first class was reserved for those who belonged there. But now, for the first time, she was on the other side. Being judged, being scrutinized, and, worst of all, being powerless. Across the galley, Claire Dawson leaned against the beverage cart, arms crossed. She had worked with Megan for a long time, but she had never seen her this rattled before. "You're really sweating this, huh?" Claire said casually. Megan turned sharply. "I don't need your input right now." Claire shrugged. "Suit yourself. But I'd start thinking about what you're going to say when we land." She paused, then added, "Because Gabriel Navarro doesn't seem like the type to let this slide." Megan clenched her jaw and ignored her. She grabbed a tray and began pouring a glass of sparkling water, determined to act normal, to pretend she was still in control. She had orders now. She had to make sure Sofia Navarro was treated like every other first-class passenger. Her hands shook slightly, but she forced them to stay steady as she walked back down the aisle, carrying the drink. Sofia didn't acknowledge her at first. She was scrolling through her phone, looking completely relaxed. And that, more than anything, made Megan's stomach twist. The girl wasn't upset. She wasn't even angry. She was just waiting. Megan cleared her throat. "Miss Navarro," she said, placing the glass of sparkling water on the tray table. "Can I get you anything else?" Sofia slowly lifted her gaze, studying Megan for a moment. "A drink?" she asked, as if surprised. Megan nodded quickly. "Yes, anything you'd like. We have fresh juice, tea, coffee." Sofia tilted her head slightly. "You didn't ask me that before." Megan stiffened. "Excuse me?" Sofia's voice remained calm. "When I first sat down," she said, "you didn't offer me anything. You didn't even greet me like you did with the other first-class passengers." She glanced around the cabin. "But now you're offering?" Megan's face burned. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to passengers questioning her, holding her accountable. She tried to keep her voice even. I apologize if I wasn't as welcoming," Megan forced out. "I assure you, it wasn't intentional." Sofia didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply watched Megan, her expression unreadable. Then, after a pause, she gave a small shrug. "I'll have a sparkling water." Megan nodded quickly, relieved the conversation was over. But as she turned to leave, Sofia's voice stopped her. "By the way," she said, lifting her phone slightly, "I texted my dad about you." Megan's stomach twisted. A fresh wave of dread crashed over her. She forced a small, tight smile. "I see." Sofia took a slow sip of her drink, watching her. Yeah, he wasn't happy. Megan already knew that. She had heard his voice on the phone just minutes ago. But hearing Sofia say it so casually, with that quiet confidence, made her stomach turn even more. "I guess we'll see what happens when we land," Sofia added, setting her glass down. Megan stiffened, nodding quickly before retreating back toward the front of the cabin. She had never wanted a flight to end so badly in her entire career. But deep down she knew her problems were only just beginning. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but Megan barely heard it. She sat in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had never felt this powerless before. She had always been the one giving instructions, setting the tone, making sure things ran smoothly. But now, she was just waiting for the plane to land, waiting for what was coming next. Across the galley, Claire still stood nearby, arms crossed. She watched Megan with quiet amusement. "You should probably sit down before you collapse," she muttered. Megan shot her a glare. "I don't." Claire smirked. "You look like you're about to pass out." Megan ignored her. She was still gripping the counter, still fighting the growing sense of dread in her stomach. Because she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Megan Brooks rubbed her temples, exhaling sharply. Claire Dawson leaned against the galley counter, arms crossed, watching her with quiet amusement. "You know," Claire said, "she handled that better than you did." Megan shot her a sharp glare. "I don't need your comments right now, Claire." Claire raised her hands in mock surrender, smirking. Suit yourself, but if I were you, I'd start thinking about what I'm going to say when we land. She tilted her head. Because Gabriel Navarro? He doesn't seem like the type to let this slide. Megan clenched her jaw and ignored her. There was no fixing this. She knew that now. Back in first class, Sofia Navarro scrolled through her phone, still calm, still unbothered. She had already won the moment she sent that first text to her father. Megan wasn't in control anymore. Now all Sofia had to do was sit back and watch it unfold. A few seats away, Jonathan Hayes hesitated, glancing over at her. He looked like he was about to say something. Then, after a moment, he cleared his throat awkwardly. I just wanted to say, he began, hesitating, that I should have spoken up earlier. Sofia looked at him, raising an eyebrow. But you didn't. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. No, I didn't, he sighed. Sometimes you don't realize what's happening in the moment, you know? But looking back, I should have said something. Sofia studied him for a moment, then she gave a small nod. Yeah, you should have. Jonathan nodded back, his face tinged with quiet embarrassment. He didn't try to justify it, he didn't make excuses, and somehow, that was enough. Sofia returned to her phone. Another message from her father popped up. Gabriel Navarro. We land in 30 minutes. Let me know if you need anything before then. A small smirk tugged at her lips as she typed back. Sofia? I'm good, just watching things unfold. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone rang. Megan flinched at the sound. She already knew who it was. With a shaky breath, she picked up the receiver. This is Miss Brooks. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. This is Gabriel Navarro. Megan swallowed hard. Gabriel didn't waste time. Once we land, he said smoothly, you will not be disembarking with the rest of the crew. You will remain on the aircraft until security meets you at the gate. Megan's stomach dropped. Sir, I expect full compliance. Gabriel cut her off. Do I make myself clear? Megan's throat was dry. Yes, sir. The line went dead. She slowly placed the phone back onto the hook, her hands trembling. Claire raised an eyebrow. Bad news? She asked. Megan shot her a look, but she didn't have the energy to respond. For the first time, she truly understood this wasn't just about one bad decision. This was about to become the biggest mistake of her career. The plane began its descent, and the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin. Passengers casually adjusted their trays, that shut down their screens, and prepared for landing. But for Megan, every second felt like a ticking time bomb. She remained in the galley, staring at the floor, her stomach twisting. Security would be waiting for her. She had no idea what that meant exactly, but she knew one thing. Her job was on the line. Claire walked past, stopping just long enough to glance at Megan. You look like you're going to be sick. Megan shot her a sharp look but said nothing. Meanwhile, in first class, Sofia buckled her seatbelt, glancing out the window as the city lights came into view. She could feel the shift in the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed her humiliation earlier were now hyper-aware of her presence. But none of them dared to speak. Her phone buzzed again. Stay seated. Security is waiting at the gate. Sofia's lips curled into a knowing smile. Oh, I will. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone rang once more. Megan flinched. But she forced herself to answer. This is Miss Brooks, she said, her voice tight. It was the captain. Miss Brooks, security has confirmed their arrival upon landing. His voice was professional, but firm. You are to remain on board until they escort you out. Understood? Megan gripped the phone tighter. She wanted to protest, to insist that this was being blown out of proportion. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Her voice came out quiet. Understood. The line went dead. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling along the runway before slowing to a stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately reached for their bags, eager to disembark. But as the doors unlocked and the flight attendants prepared for departure, the uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. The sight alone was enough to cause murmurs among the passengers. Some stole quick glances. Others openly watched, curious about what was happening. Megan's heart pounded in her chest, because she knew they were here for her. The officer walked past the first-class section, past the business-class passengers, past the travelers waiting to disembark. He stopped in front of the galley. Miss Brooks, His voice was calm but firm. Megan's breath hitched. Slowly, stiffly, she stepped forward. Yes? The officer's expression remained unreadable. You'll need to come with us. A few passengers audibly gasped. Others exchanged looks, whispering amongst themselves. Megan swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep her composure. Is this really necessary? She asked, forcing a weak smile. The officer didn't blink. Mr. Navarro has requested a formal review of the incident regarding the removal of a first-class passenger. He'll be escorted for questioning. The weight of the moment crashed down on her. She had spent years building her career, climbing the ranks, making herself indispensable. And now? Now she was the one being escorted off the plane. Her legs felt like lead as she walked down the aisle. Passengers watched, whispering in hushed tones, some with quiet amusement, others with disapproval. As she neared the first-class section, she made the mistake of glancing at Sophia. Sophia wasn't smug. She wasn't grinning or gloating. She simply watched, calm, composed. And somehow, that made it worse. Megan tore her gaze away and kept walking. As she stepped off the plane, the full weight of everything truly settled in. She had lost control. She had lost her position. And now, she had to face the consequences. The moment Megan stepped into the terminal, the bright lights felt like a spotlight shining directly on her. Security officers flanked her on either side, their pace steady but firm. She could feel the eyes of airport staff and passengers as they turned to watch. Some whispered, others openly stared. She had walked through this airport countless times before, always with confidence, always in control. But now, she felt exposed. Like a criminal being escorted through the terminal. At the end of the jet bridge, two airline executives stood waiting. Their expressions were unreadable, their arms crossed in silent judgment. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a sharp suit, stepped forward. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice cool but professional. "Come with us." Megan swallowed hard and nodded stiffly. The security officers stepped aside, allowing the executives to take over. She followed them through a restricted door, leading into the private corridors of the airport. The areas regular passengers never saw. The walls were sterile. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and jet fuel. She had walked these halls before, but never like this. They reached a small conference room. A long table stretched across the center, a few chairs neatly arranged. The airline's logo was displayed on the wall behind the head seat. One of the executives gestured toward a chair. "Sit!" Megan hesitated for a split second, then obeyed. The silver-haired man took the seat across from her, clasping his hands together. His name tag read, Michael Langford, Senior Operations Manager. Megan had met him once before, in passing. But now his gaze held nothing but cold scrutiny. "You do realize why you're here, correct?" he asked. Megan straightened in her seat, trying to regain whatever authority she had left. "I was informed there was a complaint about a seating issue." Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. "A seating issue," he repeated, his voice carrying a slight edge. He tilted his head slightly. "Miss Brooks, do you understand who you removed from first class?" She forced herself to hold his gaze. "I do now." Michael studied her. "Do you?" Megan's fingers curled around the arms of the chair. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to humiliate the daughter of the airline's owner," Michael interrupted. "Or you didn't mean to assume she didn't belong in first class." Megan's throat tightened. Silence stretched between them. Michael leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Let's be clear, Miss Brooks." His tone was icy. "This is not about a simple seating mix-up. If it were, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation." He let the words sink in. "This is about why you questioned her ticket when you didn't question anyone else's. This is about why you spoke to her with a tone you wouldn't have used on another passenger." Megan's jaw clenched. I was just following protocol." Michael scoffed, shaking his head. "No, you weren't." His voice was calm, but the words cut deep. "Protocol requires that if there's an issue with seating, you check the flight manifest first. You didn't do that, did you?" Megan stayed silent. Michael's gaze didn't waver. "You also didn't radio the gate agent to verify the ticket." His voice remained even. "You made a decision based purely on assumption. And then, to make matters worse, you spoke down to a minor in front of the entire first-class cabin." Megan felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to defend herself, to say that it wasn't that serious, that it wasn't intentional. But how could she argue? when the evidence was right in front of her, the evidence was stacked against her. Michael Langford leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "How long have you been with this airline?" Megan's voice came out quietly. 10 years. Michael nodded. 10 years. He let the words settle, then added, "That's a long time. Long enough to know how things work. Long enough to know better." The words hit harder than she expected. Michael pulled out a folder and flipped it open. Inside were documents, passenger statements, a report from the captain, and worst of all, a printed complaint directly from Gabriel Navarro himself. Michael tapped the paper with 2 fingers. "Mr. Navarro has already made it clear that this incident will not be ignored." Megan's breath hitched. "What does that mean?" Michael's voice remained even. "It means that as of now you are suspended without pay, pending a full review by the board." Her stomach dropped. "Suspended?" Michael's tone remained cold. "A final decision will be made within the week, but if I were you, I wouldn't be optimistic." Megan's hands trembled slightly. I've given 10 years to this airline. You can't just..." Michael's eyes darkened. "Miss Brooks, if this were any other passenger, we'd still be having this conversation." He leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "The only difference?" He let the pause hang. "It wouldn't be just a suspension. It would be immediate termination." Megan's mouth opened, then closed. Michael sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, I'll be honest with you." His voice softened slightly, but not much. "You might have a chance to appeal, but only if you take full accountability. If you admit your mistake. If you show that you're willing to learn from it." His tone sharpened again. "But if you sit here making excuses, defending yourself, then this is the end of your career in aviation." Megan swallowed hard. She had spent years building her reputation, climbing the ranks, thinking she was untouchable. But now, everything she had worked for was hanging by a thread. Michael studied her for a long moment. Then he closed the folder. "That's all for now." He stood, signaling the conversation was over. Megan, still frozen in shock, slowly rose from her seat. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to argue, to demand another chance, but she knew it wouldn't matter. A security officer stepped into the room, waiting to escort her out. As Megan turned to leave, Michael spoke one last time. "Maybe next time, before you judge someone by how they look," he said coolly, "you'll think twice." Megan didn't reply. She walked out of the room, her head low, her stomach twisted in knots. And for the first time in 10 years, she had no idea what her future looked like. Megan walked through the airport terminal in a daze, each step feeling heavier than the last. The security officer at her side didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort or reassurance. There was nothing to say. She had heard her fate loud and clear, and the reality of it settled over her like a lead weight in her chest. Suspended. Without pay. Her hands clenched into fists as she navigated through the terminal, ignoring the stares from passing employees and travelers. Some people had already heard what happened. News like this traveled fast in the airline industry, especially when it involved someone as powerful as Gabriel Navarro. She had always walked through these halls with a sense of authority, head held high, uniform pristine. But now she felt like an outsider. When she reached the exit doors, she hesitated. The airport had been her second home. She had spent years inside these walls, working tirelessly, making sure flights ran smoothly, ensuring passengers followed the rules. But now, she was the one being removed, like a problem that needed to be handled. The security officer cleared his throat, gesturing toward the exit. Without another word, she stepped outside. The cool air hit her skin as the doors slid shut behind her. The noise of the city filled her ears. Honking cars, distant chatter, the hum of planes overhead, and for the first time in her life, she had never felt more alone. Meanwhile, inside the airport, things were moving quickly. Sofia Navarro sat in the first-class lounge, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. She had been escorted here shortly after the plane landed, per her father's request. The lounge was quiet and elegant, plush leather chairs, warm lighting. A few passengers were scattered around, sipping coffee, checking their phones, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through the terminal. She wasn't waiting long. A few minutes later, the glass doors slid open, and in walked the man she had been waiting for. Gabriel Navarro. He carried himself with the same quiet authority he always had. Tall, well-dressed. His presence alone commanded respect. He was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His words carried weight simply because of who he was. As he approached, Sophia stood, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Hey, Dad." Gabriel Navarro gave his daughter a long look, then sighed. Pulling her into a brief but firm hug, he asked, "You okay?" Sophia nodded. "I'm good." He pulled back slightly, studying her face, making sure she wasn't just saying that to make him feel better. "They didn't mess with you after you went back to first class?" Sophia smirked. "Nope. I think they were too scared." Gabriel exhaled, shaking his head. "They should be." They both sat down, the tension in the air finally beginning to ease. Gabriel folded his hands in front of him. "So, tell me everything." Sophia recounted the entire story. The moment Megan approached her, the way she dismissed her ticket, the humiliation of being forced to move. She kept her tone even, never exaggerating, never making it more dramatic than it needed to be. Gabriel listened intently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, didn't react with sudden anger. But Sophia knew him well enough to see the fire burning behind his eyes. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. She suspended. His voice was matter of fact. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Just suspended?" He met her gaze. "For now." Sophia considered that. "You're giving her a chance to explain herself?" Gabriel nodded. "I believe in accountability, but I also believe in fairness." His voice was calm, but there was no doubt in his authority. She needs to own up to what she did. If she does, then maybe she can fix herself. He shrugged. If she doesn't, then she won't work for this airline ever again. Sophia leaned back in her chair, processing that. "Do you think she'll own up to it?" Gabriel exhaled, rubbing his chin. "Some people don't learn until they lose everything." Sophia thought about Megan's face when she had come to apologize. The tension in her voice, the way she had tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. It wasn't. It was a choice, a bad one. Sophia shook her head. She won't get her job back. Her voice was confident. People like her never admit they were wrong. Gabriel gave a small, thoughtful nod. "We'll see." He glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting with the board in an hour." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "New policies?" Her father nodded. "Bias training, more oversight on first-class treatment, a stronger system for passengers to report discrimination." His voice was steady. "This isn't just about you, Sophia. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Sophia felt a strange sense of pride settle in her chest. This wasn't just about punishing Megan. This was about change. She picked up her drink, taking a slow sip. "So basically, she just helped make the airline better." Gabriel chuckled, shaking his head. "Ironic, isn't it?" Sophia smirked. "Karma's funny like that." Her father's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then sighed. "They're ready for me." He stood up, adjusting his suit. "You coming with me, or heading home?" Sophia stretched, then stood as well. "I think I'll stick around. I want to see what happens next." Gabriel smiled. "That's my girl." They walked out of the lounge together, side by side, the weight of the day settling behind them. Megan Brooks sat alone in her apartment, staring blankly at her laptop screen. The formal suspension notice sat in her inbox. The words were bold and cold. "Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid suspension pending further review." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the email, her stomach churning. She had spent 10 years with the airline, moving up in the ranks, gaining seniority, being respected. And now, it had all crumbled in a matter of hours. The world outside her window moved on without her. People walking, cars honking, the city breathing. But for Megan, everything had stopped. Her phone buzzed. "Claire Dawson." She hesitated before answering. "What?" There was a pause. Then Claire's voice came through, casual as always. "Just checking in. How's unemployment treating you?" Megan exhaled sharply. "I'm suspended, not fired." "For now," Claire said. Then after a beat, "So, what's your plan?" Megan pressed her fingers against her temple. "I don't know. I need to think." "Think about what?" Claire asked. "Whether you should beg for your job back or pretend none of this happened." Megan gritted her teeth. "You don't get it." Claire laughed, a short, amused sound. "Oh, I get it." Her voice was smooth, effortless. "You got caught. You've been doing this for years, acting like you run the cabin, treating some passengers differently than others, making judgments before even checking a ticket." A pause. "But this time, you messed with the wrong person." Megan's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean to." Claire laughed again, but this time it wasn't amused. It was sharp. "That's the thing, Megan. You did mean to." Linda Brooks sat frozen, the weight of Claire's words pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but the truth was staring her in the face. Claire had been blunt, maybe too blunt, but she wasn't wrong. Linda had made a choice. She had seen a black girl in first class, and instead of assuming she belonged, she assumed she didn't. That was her mistake. For the first time, Linda had no response. Silence stretched between them before Claire let out a sigh. "Look, I don't hate you, but if you want to survive this, you need to own it. The airline is giving you a chance to explain yourself, but if you keep pretending this wasn't what it was, you're done." Linda swallowed and stared at her screen. Her suspension notice was still open in front of her, the words cold and final. She had a choice. She could keep fighting, keep making excuses, or she could finally admit the truth. She shut her laptop, but Claire's words kept echoing in her mind. "You made a decision?" She hated to admit it, but deep down, she knew Claire was right. She had spent years making quick judgments about passengers, deciding who belonged and who didn't, often without realizing the weight of her actions. But this time, she had been caught. And this time, it had cost her everything. Her phone buzzed again, but she ignored it. She needed to think. For years, she had told herself she was just following protocol. But was that really true? Had she ever second-guessed herself when questioning certain passengers? Had she ever looked at a well-dressed businessman or a wealthy older woman and assumed they didn't belong? No, but she had looked at Sofia Navarro and assumed exactly that. She rubbed her temples, frustration building inside her. The airline was offering her one chance, to take accountability, to own up to what she did. If she refused, she already knew the outcome. She'd be fired permanently. The idea of losing everything terrified her. She had worked too hard for this job, spent too many years climbing the ranks, sacrificed too much. She wasn't ready to let it go. Exhaling sharply, she grabbed her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Was she really going to do this? Her pride screamed at her to put the phone down, to find another way, to wait and see if the airline would forget about all of this in a few weeks. But another voice, the one telling her she had been wrong, pushed her forward. She pressed the call button. The line rang twice before a calm, deep voice answered. "This is Gabriel Navarro." Linda's stomach twisted. This was the last person she wanted to talk to, but she forced herself to speak. "Mr. Navarro, this is Linda Brooks." There was a brief silence. Then his voice came through, sharp but composed. "I'm listening." Linda took a breath. This was it. "I need to speak with you, and with Sofia." "Why?" Gabriel asked, his tone unreadable. Linda swallowed hard. "Because I owe her an apology. A real one." Another pause. She could hear the faint murmur of voices in the background, probably from his office. For a moment, she thought he might just hang up, dismiss her completely. But then he spoke again, his voice controlled. "Why now?" Linda gripped the phone tighter. "Because I need to do the right thing." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Gabriel sighed. "Meet me at the corporate office tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." Linda exhaled, relief washing over her. "Yes, sir." "Thank you." The call ended. She set her phone down and stared at the wall. The hardest part was yet to come. The next morning, Linda sat in the waiting area of Navarro Airlines corporate headquarters, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had walked into this building many times before, attending meetings, training sessions, briefings. But today, she was here for judgment. The receptionist finally gestured toward the conference room doors. "You can go in now." Linda stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The room was modern and spacious, the walls lined with aviation-themed artwork. Seated at the long glass table was Gabriel Navarro, his presence commanding as always. And next to him, sitting with a composed expression, was Sofia Navarro. Linda hesitated. The last time she had seen Sofia, the girl had been calm, powerful, and completely in control of the situation. Now, she was sitting across from her, waiting. Gabriel folded his hands together and gestured for Linda to sit. She lowered herself into the chair, her throat dry. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Gabriel leaned back, his sharp gaze locked onto Linda. "You asked for this meeting," he said simply. "So talk." Linda swallowed. This was it. No excuses, no scripted corporate apologies, just the truth. She turned to Sophia. I was wrong, she said. Linda took a shaky breath and forced herself to meet Sophia's gaze. I shouldn't have questioned your ticket. I shouldn't have treated you differently. And I definitely shouldn't have embarrassed you in front of an entire cabin. Her voice was quiet but steady. Sophia studied her carefully, her expression unreadable. Why did you? The question hit Linda harder than she expected. She could lie, say it wasn't personal, claim it was just a mistake, but she already knew the truth. She dropped her gaze for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she looked back up, she spoke honestly. Because I made a judgment about you the second I saw you. I didn't even think twice, and that's on me. Gabriel remained silent, studying her closely. Linda let out a slow breath. I didn't mean to treat you unfairly, but the truth is, that doesn't matter. What matters is that I did. Sophia didn't respond right away. Instead, she gave a small nod, like she had already known the answer but had wanted to hear Linda say it out loud. Linda sat still, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Then finally, Gabriel spoke. So what now? The weight of his question settled over Linda. What now? She had admitted she was wrong, had taken responsibility, something she never thought she would have to do. But was that enough? Would an apology be enough to erase what had happened? She looked at Sophia again, searching for an answer in the young girl's face. Sophia remained unreadable, her fingers lightly tapping against the conference table. She had been in control of the situation from the moment the plane landed, and even now, she held all the power. Linda took a breath. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said carefully. And I know that saying sorry doesn't undo what I did. But I want to make this right. Sophia tilted her head slightly. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Linda swallowed, glancing at Gabriel, but his face remained unreadable. This wasn't going to be easy. She had spent her entire career giving orders, not asking for second chances. But now, she was on the other side. I want to be better, she admitted. I want to understand what I did wrong, beyond just this incident. I don't want this to happen again. Not just to you, but to anyone else. Sophia narrowed her eyes slightly. You sound like you're reading from a corporate handbook. Linda flinched. I'm not. I mean it. For the first time, Gabriel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was smooth, controlled. You had no problem making assumptions about my daughter, he said. Now, let me make one about you. Linda tensed but didn't speak. You didn't think twice about asking Sophia to move, Gabriel continued. That means this wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was a pattern. A way of thinking you've probably had for years. You're comfortable making snap decisions about people based on how they look. Linda wanted to protest, to defend herself, but what could she say? He was right. Gabriel sighed, shaking his head slightly. Do you even know how many complaints have been filed about you? Linda's stomach dropped. Complaints? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. She had never been formally reprimanded. Never received an official warning. She had assumed she had an untarnished record. I don't know, she admitted hesitantly. Gabriel slid a folder across the table toward her. Then take a look. Linda stared at it, her heart pounding. Slowly she opened it. Inside were printed reports, passenger complaints, written statements from previous flights. Her hands shook as she read them. The flight attendant seemed dismissive when I asked for assistance. She checked my ticket twice but didn't do the same for anyone else. I felt unwelcome in first class. The complaints weren't just about Sophia. There were dozens of them. Linda's mouth went dry. I never saw these before. Gabriel gave her a knowing look, because no one ever pushed for them to be reviewed, until now. Linda flipped through the pages, her face heating up. Had she really been like this for so long? Had she ignored people's discomfort because she never thought it was a problem? She had always thought of herself as a professional, someone who knew her job well. But looking at these complaints, she saw a different picture. Sophia leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. So tell me, Miss Brooks, she said, her voice calm but firm. Now that you know this wasn't just a mistake, what do you plan to do about it? Linda's throat tightened. She had come here expecting to apologize. She hadn't expected to have her entire career laid out in front of her like a case file. She could feel Gabriel watching her, waiting. He wasn't just going to hand her job back because she said she was sorry. If she wanted to prove she had changed, she had to do more than just talk. She had to act. Linda closed the folder, her hands still shaking slightly. "I don't have an answer for you yet," she admitted, "but I want to find one." Sophia studied Linda for a long moment, her gaze sharp but unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave the smallest nod. Gabriel exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "I'll be honest, Miss Brooks. I don't think you're ready to come back to work, not yet." Linda swallowed, bracing herself for what was coming next. She had expected punishment, a final decision, but then Gabriel continued. "I'm willing to give you a choice." Linda's breath caught in her throat. Gabriel folded his hands together. "You can take your suspension, walk away, find another airline, start over somewhere else. Pretend this never happened." He paused. "Or, you take the next few months and do the work. Real training, real bias education, real accountability. And if, and only if, you can prove you've changed, we'll consider your reinstatement." Linda stared at him, the weight of his words settling in. "You're giving me a second chance?" Gabriel's expression remained firm. "No, I'm giving you the opportunity to earn one." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "If you're really serious about being better, then prove it." Linda's heart pounded in her chest. She had walked into this meeting expecting consequences, expecting a final judgment. Instead, she was being given a choice, a difficult one. Starting over somewhere else would be easier. Finding another airline that wouldn't dig too deeply into why she left, where she could pretend none of this ever happened, would be the simple way out. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. This wasn't something she could just walk away from. The folder in front of her, the passenger complaints spanning years, was proof of that. This wasn't about one mistake. This was about a pattern. She looked across the table at Sophia. The girl wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She wasn't waiting to see Linda fail. She was just watching to see what kind of person Linda really was. Gabriel leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Well," he asked, "what's it going to be, Miss Brooks?" Linda swallowed hard. She had never been in this position before. She had always been the one making decisions, the one in control. But now, she was at their mercy. And for the first time in years, she had to admit something to herself. She didn't like the person she had become. She took a slow breath, then pushed the folder back toward Gabriel. "I want to do the work," she said quietly. "Not just for the job. For myself." Sophia and Gabriel exchanged a glance. "Are you sure?" Gabriel asked. "This isn't just about keeping your job." Linda shook her head. "No. I mean, yes. Of course I want my job back. But this has made me realize something." She gestured to the folder. "All these complaints, I ignored them because I thought I was just doing my job. I thought I was enforcing the rules, but I see it now." She exhaled, her shoulders dropping. "I made decisions about people without even thinking, and that's not the kind of person I want to be." Sophia studied her for a long moment, then finally spoke. "Then prove it." Linda nodded. "I will." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. Then, with a small nod, he pulled a document from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "This is your agreement," he said. "You'll be on unpaid suspension for the next 3 months. You'll be required to complete bias training, diversity education, and customer relations workshops." Linda reached for the paper, skimming through the text. Gabriel continued, his voice steady. "Once your training is completed, you'll undergo a final review. If we believe you've actually changed, you'll be reinstated. But you won't return as a senior flight attendant. You'll start at a lower rank and earn your way back up." Linda's stomach twisted. She had worked so hard for her position. The idea of starting over was painful. But wasn't that the whole point? She had used her authority as a shield, as a way to justify how she treated passengers. Maybe losing that authority was exactly what she needed. She nodded slowly. "I understand." Sophia tapped a finger against the table. "And just so we're clear, if you try to coast through this without actually learning anything, if you show up just to check boxes but don't actually change." Gabriel finished the sentence for her. "Then you're done. Permanently." Linda swallowed. "I won't waste this chance." Gabriel slid a pen toward her. "Then sign it." Linda hesitated for only a moment before picking up the pen and signing her name. It was done. She had chosen the hard road. 3 months later, the airport felt different as Linda Brooks walked through the terminal. clutching a folder filled with certificates. Bias training, diversity awareness, customer service retraining. She had completed every requirement Navarro Airlines had set for her. But had she actually changed? That was what today was about. As she approached the corporate offices, her nerves were on edge. The past 3 months had been the hardest of her career. She had been forced to sit in rooms where people told stories of being treated exactly the way she had treated Sophia. She had listened, uncomfortable but unable to look away, as people described the humiliation of being judged, ignored, dismissed. She had thought about Sophia every single day. When she finally reached the reception desk, the assistant gave her a nod. "Mr. Navarro is expecting you." Linda took a deep breath and stepped into the conference room. Gabriel Navarro sat at the head of the table, flipping through a file. Sophia was there too, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. Linda took a seat. Gabriel set the folder down. "You completed all the training?" "Yes, sir," Linda said. He nodded. "And what did you learn?" Linda hesitated. She could have rattled off a list of corporate-approved answers, but that wasn't what he was asking. He wanted to know if she had actually learned something. She glanced at Sophia. The girl hadn't said anything yet, but Linda could tell she was waiting for the truth. Linda exhaled. "I learned that I never actually saw my passengers before." "Not really." Gabriel raised an eyebrow, motioning for her to continue. Linda licked her lips, her hands tightening in her lap. "I thought I was just enforcing the rules, but the truth is, I was deciding who was worthy of certain treatment and who wasn't, and I never realized how much harm that caused." Sophia leaned forward slightly. "So if I walked onto one of your flights tomorrow and sat in first class, what would you do?" Linda met her eyes. "I'd offer you a drink just like everyone else, and I'd assume you belong there, because you do." For the first time, Sophia gave a small approving nod. Gabriel studied Linda for a moment longer, then closed the file. "You're reinstated," he said, "but under probation, you'll start at a junior position. No special privileges, no fast-track promotions. You'll have to prove over time that you deserve to be here." Linda nodded. "I understand." Gabriel stood. "Then we're done here." Sophia stood as well, grabbing her bag. She paused before leaving and turned back to Linda. "You know," Sophia said, a hint of amusement in her voice, "I wasn't even thirsty that day, but I'm glad you finally got around to offering me a drink." Linda let out a small chuckle. "Took me long enough, huh?" Sophia smirked. "Yeah, it did." Then she left, walking side by side with her father. Linda remained in the room for a few moments, taking it all in. She wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that flight months ago. She wasn't sure if she'd ever be, and maybe that was a good thing. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in this situation? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.